criminal confederacy, which has engaged in insurrection against these United States, are using secret MK Ultra type surveillance mechanisms in order to engage in human trafficking and something they prefer to call cognitive suppression, which is directly the violation of the freedom of association, as well as torture, which includes the use of sleep deprivation with the use of electro and other shock therapies, as is specifically consistent with studies which they've conducted, which includes the use of torturing monkeys, which killed monkeys based upon their amount of radio signals sent to them, at which point the trauma destroyed their brains and actively engaged in the ability to engage in no contact coercion, otherwise known as a gun. The use of the non-lethal gun is able to actively engage in many changeable routines, which is the mechanism that they're used in order to engage in the Savannah project. I forgot the Savannah syndrome, which is the use of American diplomats being attacked by no-touch technology, which engages in the act of harassment, which is the secret Confederate terrorist attack against American politicians in order to engage in false flags, which are terrorist attacks that actually happen under the direct order of those using the mechanisms, pretending to be some foreign adversary beyond the Confederate insurgent parasite, which is actively engaging in false aggression, at which point the mechanism is designed for kiting. So if you have an enemy that's beyond your strength or that you don't want to have to fight, you kite that enemy against another enemy, and these two enemies fight instead of you, which is an active strategy in games and whatnot, which allows them the advantage to engage in these politics controls, at which point they can manufacture criminal events such as the Manchurian candidates through their assassinations of presidents and other leaders in order to engage in capture mechanisms, which they use and are able to approach the leaders in question and assert the position that the Confederacy is in control and not the Republic elected politician, at which point the politician is told that they are to restrain themselves and follow orders underneath this Confederate insurrection over the federal government, at which point you have several policies specifically being generated. Their projections of David Ball's character assumed his wealth and status would assert the inevitability of him becoming a secret general over a new branch of the military, specifically loyal and subject to the president, at which point the subversion to this Confederate insurrection is specifically vulnerable to the president, which would recapture them under the use of David Ball's character at the point of origin concerning these secret missions that cannot be discussed in any real depth beyond the cursory overview of the fact that it is necessary to national security, such as the function of stopping 9/11, which would have happened. David's branch as a character is not subject to the Confederacy, at which point ignoring the direct order in order to shut off the air security, such as Giuliani redirecting into training the jets, would not work with David, who can just ignore them. As his own branch of the military at the top-ranked position, there is no authority beyond the president, beyond a direct order from the president. It becomes functionally impossible stopping the insurrectionist function, at which point the projection of the crash of '08 was also asserted, at which point the full due diligence and the full calculation concerning the projected schedule of David's character's economic exchanges in the general network would have been constructed and cemented, at which point they could have been subcontracted and redistributed in order to be built on and diversify from. At which point, the assumption is that their agenda would be to get David to start a new country, which could not happen until David had stabilized the United States and had finished his functions as general, engaging in national security to the satisfaction of himself and those loyal to the Republic, at which point the ability to leave becomes viable and possible. Cannot renounce duty until the mission is finished, at which point the stability of the United States being certified, he would no longer have to do so, and then yada 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 yada. At which point the assumption of the freedom of association obstructed by the insurrectionist terrorist attack is an attack on the freedom of association through the subversion of substantive due process, which is specifically an interesting policy because it's designed specifically for David Bohl's cover concerning his general office in his impossible secret missions. These functional positions require the protection from investigation and surveillance of David Bohl, who needs the general public to have this excuse in order to cover for his secret missions from the government, at which point the national security is violated by not having the substantive due process for everyone to cover for the agents in question under David's control, who need these policies specifically to protect them throughout whatever thing ordered by the informed president of the full due diligence concerning the secrets digested in the branch of the military specific for David's character, which reports exclusively to the president. At which point you have these series of actions concerning the overarching interest of the right of liberty of uncoerced morality, and uncoerced morality cannot include the ability to legislate against morality. If you can legislate morality, you can engage in a government-established religion, with the government being a superior entity, qualifying it as the religion of government, certifying such engagements as the Confederate wizards' social engineering or terrorist programs, the hate crime of using violence and the threat of violence in order to engineer the structure and strata and maintenance of the general public, includes their terrorist attacks against the black community, which has engaged in economic hitmen, which have actively suppressed their overarching ability and subversion of their ability to progress through the various policies and specific hit jobs, such as the ones contracted by the FBI, which have used cover stories such as their opposition to communism, which is generated by the social engineering so that they have something to hate, at which point the framing of those communities in the engineered culture allows them to blame the manufactured culture, which is the use of the fruit of the poison tree, which is defrauding the courts, which is the active subversion of the ability to engage in a rational society, which cannot function under these conditions in the middle of this espionage civil war by the Confederates, which have sought its destruction. The use of these abuses, which included torturing David from the point of birth and his parents and whatnot, long-standing, this going before LBJ and others had been an accessory before the fact, long before, to the contingency to the Nazi coup over the United States, which is an off-branch of the Confederate Civil War, which is actively using the false title of secrets in order to engage in wizard functions, which is the application of secret science not submittable to court, allowing it to be functional, active, as plausible deniability under the mechanism of wizard terrorism. At which point, the upgrading from the old school burning crosses is unnecessary because you have other mechanisms of terrorism and subversions. The function of engaging in the GOAT mechanism, such as is made famous or making famous from Joe Rogan, which is the function of goats being overpopulated, at which point you have a captured goat who is neutered and set off to find other wild goats, tracked to find the other wild goats. It runs and finds the other wild goats, at which point the entire herd except for the goat is shot, at which point you had the eradication of the large function of those goats to the mass population control of the goats, which is the functional position of the mechanism of the Confederates for population control, which is derivative of the European position of climate change and others, which had generated under the position of genetic engineering, such as their act of having sex with the indigenous in order to purify the black, at which point, when you purify the black, you have mixed out and redeemed their genetic lines, at which point you have these, what do you call it, breeding programs, at which point it's similar to breeding dogs, and it's all genetic variation. And as we know from breeding dogs, that it is genetic defects which are actively and selectively bred for, which decrease the total value of the breed, qualifying the major injury to the total value, at which point you have genetic superiorists who are actively degrading their genes under the functionality of being superior while inferior for the inbreeding mechanism of selective breeding, such as the Plato's conspiracy used by Manus and many of the others as characters. From the record, they have engaged in many issues such as the Portland Girl Office, which is basically just government asserted infiltration mechanisms, false women engaged in dating in order to collect intelligence, at which point the women go in and they get their dates, and then they collect their intelligence and they generate their contracts and they accomplish their various missions, at which point you have the culmination of their investments on this subject, and their character for David Bowles would not have stayed with them long enough for them to have accomplished their missions, qualifying their retaliation ahead of time, having not reached their speculators, but their obligation to make the investment inside them in order to qualify their access, at which point you have the mechanism defeated, engaged in the act of revenge, at which point their position goes from the free association of them competing with the rest of them to sexual control over the target, at which point you have the general mutilation, terrorist assaults, such as the social engineering, which has actively diverted romantic interests away from the targets, at which point you have the various abuses which are normal to California, such as the transgender and gay communities, which are actively manufactured by the secret programs and the eugenics programs, which have sought the murdering of entire lines which are based upon these genetic defects under the secret mechanisms of terrorism from the KKK surveillance mechanism, certifying their ability to generate the various controls necessary in order to use the use of coercion, such as J-cycle civil war, which is the coercion to overthrow the other sovereign states in order to subjugate them to the larger J-cycle California pedophile market. Now, the pedophile market is generically local and state officials who are protected by the local and state police to engage in the mechanisms of their pedophile markets, which are protected under these mechanisms, which it's I think it's unitary executive theory, the assumption that their position makes them different. So the respecting of status in office, which is specifically prohibited in order to treat them differently, is ignored, and the two-tiered or several-tiered mechanism of law becomes validated, at which point you have the use of the judiciary, which surpasses its loyalty to the law, at which point it subjugating the law to itself instead of it serving the law as in breach of oath, at which point it subjugates itself to the executive, at which point the executive is excessive to the law, at which point the function of the pedophile markets are an extra law function, which qualifies its permanent protection and reproduction, at which point you have the act of terrorist attacks and harassments and subversions in order to intimidate the victims into subjugation, qualifying their permanent abuse system, certifying the fact that they will never actually get justice under these Confederate mechanisms, which will progress back into the natural state which has developed thus far and will continue to go back into its original form, and once it's reached critical mass, it will accelerate exponentially into the larger mechanism, which it is bankrupted in the Great Depression as well as the Great Dust Bowl, which is basically Roundup on the farmlands, at which point you have the functional manufactured position of aggression, which compels the unitary action of forcing the United States to engage in the war, at which point the Great Depression, which was manufactured by the use of taking the stock market money and giving it to the Germans under the position that they would not be able to engage in military development, which was specifically ignored in favor of the ability to engage in military engagements. At which point, when the Germans were told to engage in the Holocaust functions, they were rebutting it at the audacity of and racism of the Confederate subvergents, which they have gained many of their policies from, and they are an upgrade to. At which point, they tried to send the United States, which was specifically rejected under the specific position of that's what they were paid to do, and the payment of the development into the Nazi system to upgrade the Confederate system tells you exactly their direct interest, such as Scalia's position of the statement that the judiciary doesn't have a right to change the legislation, as an illegal law cannot be opposed under these Confederate scumbags' position on the false originalist mechanism. At which point you have the mechanism of these new judges, which are specifically chosen as false conservatives in order to engage in the Confederate insurrection, to overthrow the United States, engage in the original Confederate mechanisms, including the obligation of the order of the executive secret genocides, such as the Holocaust being reproduced for the Jews, which is a mechanism which includes the Nazi variant, which have infiltrated the Israelis, I believe, at which point you have the active subversions and of their national interests, which have engaged in aiding and abetting these Nazi inside the United States, which are specifically potent within the FBI, which failed its original coup and then diversified, such as into the Senate, the Congress, and the military, etc. At which point you have the certification of their compliance into the Jewish mafia, which is not limited by their constitution, which they do not have, specifically as to allow room for their Jewish mafia, which has the false mechanism of having received Israel as a payment for the Holocaust that's happening, which is an insurance fraud mechanism, which is the restart mechanism for the second Holocaust, which is the second insurance fraud mechanism, which the Jewish mafia, not limited by law, specifically is developing and approving of through J-cycle civil war and other maturing into Nazi policy mechanisms. At which point you have the certification of their Suicide Squad, which is basically just a bunch of suicide bombers for the larger mission in order to engage in the dismantlement of the larger international community, which breaks down into Revelation Satanism, which has been specifically manufactured in secret by the covens generated, such as the KKK, which are a mechanism of the secret society wizard cults, at which point the wizard covens have absolute functional control over all governments, at which point they generate their son of perdition, which is matured into the position of using the largest valuable title to engage in its development, and then at a certain point it switches against them, at which point you have them use this surveillance to nerve hack the person, at which point they're overtaken by the spirit of Satan, at which point they become the Antichrist, at which point all of the things that they have planned for their utopia, which doesn't exist and is in fact nowhere. We need the full investigation of the uncensoring, the full investigation of the due diligence, the full investigation of the full investigation to uncensor all of these variable secrets which have actively supported insurrection against the United States under the false titles, and these mechanisms of high corruption throughout the system, which is designed to collapse by a parasite infecting and killing the host, at which point the Confederacy infects and kills the United States, and the Republic, which is their enemy and they've declared war on, will collapse exponentially into the injury. Many of the secrets, such as the use of MKUltra, uses colleges such as Harvard and many of the other competitors of the School of Hard Knocks, which was specifically contracted against by the Confederate double agents in the United States, which has created customs and policies specifically designed to stop it, at which point the prohibition against the Bowles family and that functional mechanism generates their ability to mass distribute their torture mechanisms, such as their creation of the Unabomber, Ted Bundy, yada yada yada. The torture of Americans, the torture of Canadians, the torture of people all over the world in order to engage in the mechanism of their addiction black market for abuse. It's dominatrix primarily, and it also includes the J-secular mechanism of pedophilia, at which point you have the abuse of children as a sexual fetish, as the mandatory ingestion being compromised and towards the position they cannot survive in the rule of law society, at which point you have the mechanism of people who are highly devoted to the concept of not being imprisoned for their fetishes, which were bred specifically under the direction of them being in the government, which they discovered was that thing much too far, at which point their discovery, having already been made after they were compromised, prevents them from returning, at which point you have all of the injuries in the trap which are only for escaping, at which point their answer is to only go deeper, which is the general mechanism of fooling them into the magic trick. Now, the mechanism of the false markets, it creates an illusion market for the black market, which allows people to demonstrate to the general public that it was fraud and a nonsense. It was a terror factory of a non-real threat. And the mechanism of the non-real threat is specifically generated to validate and disguise as plausible deniability for their real one, at which point the look over here as I do the magic trick is the mechanism that they are exploiting, at which point you have the use of false secrets in order to protect this with the distractions and their infinite exchange for the investigations and their investigations toward the due diligence being revealed, such as the FBI, the Unit A records transfers to the Unit B records, transfers to Unit C records, at which point they take forever and drag their feet, and then they give you A after they moved it to B, and then they drag the feet and yada yada yada, B turns to C, and so on, at which point you have the express position of never truly giving the due diligence, so the general public cannot engage in an educated answer, which is voter fraud, and that functionality of voter fraud is a fundamental position to obstruct necessary information in order to engage in an educated answer for the ability to have a popular government. And the certification of their distraction to the legal government is the mechanism to overthrow the United States, which is incomplete in and of itself and has the total mechanism surrounding it, by which validates the total control and choking out of the American will and gerrymandered into non-existence through a series of awkward scenarios specifically generated to protect their criminal nature as Confederates, at which point you have the return to the normalization of Confederacy and plantation, at which point you have the collapse of the oil and other major industries concerning the ability to engage in easy travel for the general community, at which point you have non-vehicle mechanisms and plantation slavery, at which point they will be whipping black people in order to pick cotton again, which is their preferred market, even though they know it is exponentially inferior and degenerate towards their interest as a total market, because it satisfies their fundamental fetish as fuckheads.